transparency so that we can get at accountability that we all need. I also wanted to encourage you all to save the date. On August 27th at 7 p.m., we're going to do another one of these things. And in this case, we're going to pick apart the proposals that are out there and look at them in some detail. So this is going to be for you campaign finance wonks, or you people that really enjoy digging into the nitty gritty, but it's going to help us as we actually push things at the State House to understand what we have there. We're also going to have an opportunity to hear from the voter rights to know folks about, what were the campaigns like that actually pushed the type of reform that we are talking about in other states. And so welcome all. Heather, Ian, you ready? All right.
Let's do it.
There's always that question of, well, where do you actually start when you have one of these presentations? And I thought it was really important. I've watched different people talk about, the constitutionality of, good transparency and oh, this is just what happens with Citizens United. It's just too bad we couldn't do it. And I wanted to be extremely clear that in 2010, when Citizens United versus FEC was determined, that they actually emphasized the merits of transparency and said that prompt disclosure of expenditures can provide citizens with the information that they need, shareholders information they need, so to hold both corporations and elected officials accountable for their positions and supporters. And the other thing is at the very end of this very long quote, there's this line: this transparency enables the electorate to make informed decisions and give proper weight to different speakers and messages. And so, when we think about it, well, why do we want to know? It's not just because we're nosy, although, frankly, I'm a little nosy. It's because what we need is the ability to understand who the speakers are, who is actually paying for advertisements, and to weigh, is there a corrupting influence? Is it inappropriately influencing our policymakers? How is the corporate decision-making working? And so as we go through all of these conversations and people bring up Citizens United, I think it's very important to have us grounded in, yes, it has been 10 years since Citizens United, but that the fact that it's the wild, wild west out there, and we have this type of corruption scandal, that's not completely because of Citizens United. If in fact our legislators had taken steps, we would not have the scandal that we have right now. And so I'm going to start with our friend here, Larry Householder. Now, Larry was a Speaker of the House at the beginning of the aughts. And during that time period, he actually had a scandal that made us all think he was actually going to be arrested by the FBI. We knew that there was an FBI investigation. Nothing really came of it. Many of you are probably thinking about Cliff Rosenberger, who had similar kind of circumstance where, he's been investigated. We all know that they took stuff out of his office, but nothing has really happened. And I think for a lot of us, it made us really cynical about what was possible and whether people will ever be held accountable. And so it was on July 21st when then the speaker, was arrested, that we were all a little bit surprised. Now you'll notice in my presentation, I talk a little bit about the dark money. And so we know that money was spent to influence the passage of House Bill 6 and provide some cover. Money was spent to get householder allies elected in office so they could vote for House Bill 6. And there was secret money that was related to pushing back on the direct democracy. So, we are so blessed in the state of Ohio to actually be able to push back on legislation that we don't like, that we can collect signatures and we can put it to a vote of the people. Now, we don't use it very often because it is actually a short time frame and it is extremely hard to do, but we still can do it. And when folks came together to push back on this bill, what happened is a ton of money was spent on really egregious ads, and Heather's going to talk about those ads. And I wanted to highlight Neil Clark, and Neil Clark was, hired gun. He represented at the time of his arrest, he had 36 clients. Just to give you an example, he actually called himself, like the speaker's hitman, and he allegedly spent nearly $500,000 in a single day to hire signature collection firms so that they couldn't actually, they wouldn't actually end up collecting signatures. It would be a conflict of interest. So, and this, I left this lovely and some might say a little vulgar quote, because this is the way he was thinking about direct democracy. He was looking at it as an attack against the speaker, and that in fact spending this money was a way to quell this type of activity. And we know that referendum was not successful. Now, as we think about, dark money and secret money, we often we get this picture of like kind of how it happens. There's a political ad. We're not sure about the source of information, but it's also pretty clear that it takes middlemen to basically organize the kind of activity that led to the householder enterprise arrest. And so here we have Matt Borges. You will remember that Matt Borges actually he ended up pleading guilty to preferential treatment to specific investment brokers in 2004. If you can imagine when we're talking about preferential treatment, you can easily imagine the kind of activities that he was doing in the treasurer's office. And his record has been expunged, and he came back to become the chair of the Republican Party and to take a stand against Donald Trump. And at the same time, he is alleged to be the person who actually went through this process to thwart the referendum by trying to get information about what was going on inside. And so one of the things that as we talk about dark money, we're often thinking about, okay, there's this dark money that is in these political ads that are, put out there to educate us or brainwash us or make us think a certain way about something. But it's also important to realize that when you have secret money, it is extremely easy to engage in shenanigans or something that is genuinely illegal, and that is what is alleged. The next batter up of our cast of characters is this guy from the Oxley Group. Now, so essentially a political consultant, lobbyist. And one of the things that is interesting in his text messages is that there is a discussion with Company A. Now, one of the things I think is also hilarious when you look at that FBI, the whole affidavit is that in fact, they continue to call First Energy Company A. So it's like there's this whole dark money thing, and we still don't exactly have First Energy label. And so we know there's going to be a peeling of the onion, but what's really clear is that he was, in this, that what is alleged is that he was responsible for organizing funds for Generation Now and buying specific ads and organizing many of those different things and ultimately approval. So it's kind of, an interesting. Here we have Jeff Longstreth. Now, he was Larry Householder's chief political aide, and he is described in the complaint like as a kind of a central kind of to strategy and thinking about how to do things. And he is alleged to have accepted more than $5 million in bribes from First Energy in exchange for his efforts. And so as we think about a $60 million scandal, I think it's really important to think about how easy, if you do not have good disclosure, if you do not, as voters, have good, accurate information, you can get into a situation where, and at this point, these kinds of activities are alleged, but not having good access to information makes it very easy for really, truly corrupt activities to occur. I threw up first energy in here so that you would see this. I think one of the things that was interesting to me as I looked at the affidavit was that Larry Householder had 84 phone contacts with the First Energy CEO, Charles Jones, and that's February 2017 to July 2019. Now, phone contacts, of course, could be texts, it could be phone calls, but 84 times until House Bill 6 was finalized. This was a really startling moment to me, and this is one that I wanted to highlight to you. I know that many of you have been reading and watching, and listening on public radio about this scandal. But one of the things that I think is really important is on July 21st, Jim Province of the Toledo Blade asked the U.S. Attorney, David DeVillers, he said, could this have happened if there was better disclosure, if we actually had better campaign finance laws? And DeVillers answered, I do not see how it could have been possible. Now, since I've been giving you a bunch of villains, I also wanted to highlight some of the heroes here, because I think it's important for us as we think about the level of corruption that if we do not have good whistleblowers, we're not going to be able to get to the reforms that we need. And so these are folks, there's individual one, who is a guy named Nick Owens. He's a former prosecutor. He's a member of the State Board of Education. And he is somebody who called the FBI tip line. He reported that he had a meeting in which Householder took credit for using $500,000 to help a candidate win. And, this struck him as extremely problematic because, of course, this violates campaign finance rules. Candidates are not supposed to be coordinating with independent expenditures or running nonprofits to benefit their campaigns or the campaigns of their friends, for that matter. And so he is somebody who made a phone call, and it started with just a call to the FBI tip hotline. And as we think about, the kinds of things that got the ball rolling, it's important to realize that there were people that were caught up in this system of legalized bribery, was one way of looking at it, a system of not having enough disclosure to figure things out, who said, wait a second, we actually need to do something so that the public can understand what's actually going on. I need to push back. This just doesn't seem right. I don't know if it is. And we're still at a point where there are a lot of things that are alleged that are not exactly clear. But as we think about, people standing up, we need to be super grateful to them. Our next hero here is Tyler Ferriman. And so one of the things that struck me, and I threw this quote in, was that Matt Borges said to him, one of the things he told me was, dude, I don't have a mortgage anymore. Like, I'm so taken care of, and we could do the same for you. And, it can be very hard when you are facing paying bills and paying your mortgage to be offered the kind of money that he was to provide insider information. And he wore a wire with his friend. And so, as we think about the people that stood up so that we better understand how dark money operated, we should be giving them a thank you. And then last but not least, I wanted to highlight Dan McCarthy. Dan is Governor DeWine's Director of Legislative Affairs. And he is somebody who ran an associated nonprofit. A lot of times we talk about Generation Now, and we know at the beginning there was a lot of money, secret money, that was spent on mailers and TV ads from Generation Now that were all about the lobbying effort. So there was secret money during the lobbying effort. And in this case, it appears as if Dan McCarthy was organizing one of the pass-throughs, because there were a couple different C4s. And one of the things, as we have conversations with Ian, he'll talk about how what can happen with C4s are one C4 will give it to another C4 and they work in a coordinated fashion. And so, you know, I think it's important as we think about what dark money is. It's all about these secrets. And we really do not need any secrets when it comes to our democracy, when it comes to our elections. And so Heather Taylor-Miesle is going to give you a lot more information. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Heather is going to be taking over. What she'll do is she'll start sharing her screen. For any of you who have been like, well, wait a second, I have a million questions. We're going to be taking questions at the end, and we're going to have kind of a panel discussion at the end. And thank you, Heather.
I think, can you guys hear me? Okay, great. I'm going to stand up because I get real excited whenever I talk about this kind of thing. So bear with me here. So first of all, thank you to Common Cause and to the Brennan Center and all you folks for inviting me to be here and caring about this issue. The Ohio Environmental Council has been in the thick of this fight for 6 years, but really for the past 51 years. We're the state's oldest environmental organization that is wholly state-based. We do energy, water, land. And in the past couple of years, we've had to spend a whole bunch of time on democracy, because the reality is that if your government is broken, it's really hard to get anything done that's really for the people. And HB 6 really provides a blueprint for bad behavior. So here we are. We're 6 months into this pandemic that is attacking our lungs, attacking our livelihoods, and today it even started to attack our football schedule. What we sadly continue to see day after day during this pandemic is that the patients that are regularly exposed to high levels of air pollution are also hospitalized more often. In fact, an April 2020 Harvard study showed that the coronavirus patients in areas that
Heather, I'm so sorry to bother you. We had a request from someone for you to maximize your screen if there was some way, because what's happening is we're seeing two different things.
Let's see how to do that. I was telling them earlier that I don't know how to do that. How's that? Is that good, Catherine? Okay, great. Perfect. Okay, so here we are in a pandemic where the reality is that in April 2020, there was a Harvard study that showed that the coronavirus patients in areas that have high levels of air pollution before the pandemic are more likely, the folks there who get coronavirus are more likely to die of infection. And then there are pocketbooks. By 2020, energy costs were already going to go up due to heat waves and climate change. Now the pandemic presents an additional unprecedented challenge and disproportionately affects those at or below the poverty line. Black and brown households, families with young children, people with disabilities, millions of households are currently struggling to really cover their energy costs. And they're living without energy in a time when that could be a matter of life and death. And what we saw with HB 6, even before these FBI indictments, was just a bad bill. And in Corona world, it's even worse because it makes us more susceptible to death and the immediate impacts of climate change, and less competitive in the future. So I started talking about this presentation with the staff as kind of a bedtime story, but the more we talked about it, the more we realized that this is really the adult version of a scary story you may tell around a campfire and hopefully with a good stiff drink. What we learned 3 weeks ago, was that our state legislature is not just not serious about the pandemic, they're not serious about climate change, and they are now also corrupt, something that we've always had suspicions of, at least in recent history, but now this is confirmed. House Bill 6 was called by many the worst energy bill of the 21st century. It was already a bad deal for Ohioans. It stuck us with dirtier air, higher utility bills, and it gutted our clean energy future. And we're talking about $61 million in corruption. So this is bad policy, but $61 million, that's an attack on our democracy, and that adds insult to energy, or insult to injury, because clean energy is actually really great for Ohio. Clean energy jobs grew more than 4 times as fast as overall statewide employment in Ohio. There were 12 times more jobs in renewable energy generation in Ohio than fossil fuels at the end of 2019. By rolling back our renewable energy standards and eliminating our energy efficiency standards, House Bill 6 threatens the gains that we've made and our clean energy future. Bottom line, this bill was a bad idea. It was also Frankenstein. HB 6 wasn't just like one bill, it ended up being several bad ideas kind of smushed into one. In fact, it was 6 years of bad ideas all in one big ugly Christmas tree. In addition to Company A, First Energy, we also had other companies who also got gifts. They wanted different things and were also trying to pass off bad ideas as bad bills for years, so they combined forces and cash. First Energy wanted to save their nuclear plants. Others wanted to save coal. You'll see here different presents. First, AEP masked itself as an organization called Empowering Ohio's Economy. Sounds great, right? Which gave Generation Now, this is the householder group, $150,000 and $200,000 to Householders PAC. They also gave to a PAC that spent $1 million for householder-favored Republicans in 2018, and it paid off. AEP is now able to charge customers $1.50 a month for an additional 6 years. Bigger companies are going to have to pay $1,500 a month. And that's going to generate about $50 million a year just for AEP. Good investment for them, bad investment for Ohio. Borges Industries is another that was involved. It's a coal company that owns Signal Peak, an underground coal operation, which FE is invested in, First Energy, I'll stop using acronyms. Wayne Borges, the head of that company, and his wife have given nearly $1.3 million to Republicans since 2016. They gave another almost $150,000 to householders' personal campaign account, and then almost $40,000 to the House GOP committee just last year. In fact, when Generation Now opened, there were 2 deposits, one from First Energy and one from Wayne Borges. And even our old pal, Bob Murray of Murray Coal got into this action. All of the AEPs, the Borges Industries, Bob Murray, it paid off because they got the same gift and were able to knock out the competition. They needed to knock out the competition because for the first time, government projections are showing that the U.S. is on track to produce more electricity from renewables than coal by the end of the year. Hundreds of aging power plants have been forced to retire since 2012, and prices are dropping on clean energy. The cost of building a large wind farm has dropped 40%, and the cost of building solar has dropped 80%. So coal effectively slowed the competition by ending Ohio's renewable and clean energy standards and keeping their old, dirty coal plants open on life support for a bit longer. Some estimate that the coal bailout is actually 2 times larger than the $1 billion coal bailout that First Energy got for nuclear. And it all worked. They won and HB 6 became law. Even many people who voted the wrong way, voted the wrong way, even when it wasn't in the best interest of their voters. You'll see 4 examples here. In each of these districts, there are more clean energy jobs at stake than ever were at stake in HB 6, and they literally voted against their community. They also voted against their changing demographics. You'll see in 3 of those districts that voters who are Black, Latinx, Indigenous have grown by double digits. These voters are twice as likely to support clean energy policies. Not only do they have the jobs, but their constituencies are more supportive of clean energy policies than ever. These members are in what we call gerrymandered districts, so they can kind of ignore their voters because their voters have been basically selected for them. They're also getting First Energy money. It may not seem like a lot on these lists, but most of these districts cost about $100,000 to win. So this is a start, and then you add in the real dark money. The Columbus Dispatch has done a series of fascinating articles on the HB6 drama. I definitely encourage you to go look at them, and some of your other hometown papers. Bischoff in Dayton is doing great work. Cincinnati Enquirer is doing some great work. We're seeing some really interesting things up in Cleveland. But the Columbus Dispatch did a fascinating article specifically on August 5th. After the bill passed the legislature, all of our coalition worked to stop this through what's called a citizen referendum process that would allow a group to get enough signatures from the public to send the bill to all the voters for consideration. When looking at single gifts of individual candidates, the dollars can look a little small, right? $3,500 here, $2,500 there. But then when taken in the aggregate, it gets big. So since 2015, for instance, First Energy has given $1 million to candidates, 70% to Republican candidates who voted for HB6. There were almost $1.5 million that were spent from Generation Now and First Energy in 2018 alone. And this doesn't even tell the whole story, because the dark money vastly outspends the direct contributions to these candidates, including more than $9 million in xenophobic TV ads that ran against us. From August 1st, 2019, all the way through October 2019, First Energy wired Generation Now $38 million. $23 million was sent to a front company and then used to fight against the ballot campaign and pay for media opposing the campaign. On top of this, they just gave straight up bribes to individuals. So you heard about Tyler in the campaign structure. They basically paid him because they wanted him to spy on the campaign. Luckily, he's a really honest guy, really hard worker, and is actually in the movement now every day working to address climate change at Clean Fuels, Ohio. In addition to trying to give straight up bribes, they had this mailer that you see in front of you that was mailed to 4.9 million homes. Every day, the opposition sent 235 people out into the field to keep tabs on our signature collectors, where they would stand and scream at people as they educated the public. When screaming or even assaulting people didn't work, they would offer individuals $2,500 plus a free plane ticket home if they quit. As a result, we came up 44,000 signatures short. The day after we came up short, $3 million more appeared in the Generation Now bank account. In fact, First Energy was so thrilled with their investment. In the early days of the pandemic this year, when everyone was losing their jobs, they gave their shareholders a $300 million gift in stock to celebrate. But this sad story is changing. Sunlight can change things even before we draw new maps, even before we understand how deep this corruption goes. In the House, 17 Republicans supported clean energy and voted against HB6. But after the scandal, 22 Republicans are now calling for the repeal, and this includes the governor of our state. On the Democratic side, 9 Democrats voted against HB6, so against clean energy. But now every single member of the Democratic caucus, with the exception of one, is calling for its repeal. Sunlight can change things. OEC's General Counsel, Trent Doherty, made a joke when all of this broke a couple of weeks ago. He said, HB6 is like COVID. Even if you did nothing dirty, you need to wash your hands. So folks are flocking to take cover by co-sponsoring this repeal. That's good news. But this emerging sunlight can quickly be sunset. The reality is that even though people have called for a repeal, there is no vote scheduled right now. In fact, the Ohio legislature just canceled yet another day next week, and it has been 12 days since Householder has been indicted. The other problem is that the bad guys who likely masterminded this entire thing are still around, and even worse, they're in charge. Here you have Sam Randazzo, who you can actually go find out more at samrandazzo.com. That delicious website just went up today from another organization, and it really points out the problems with him being the head of the Public Utilities Commission, because he used to be the head of the Industrial Energy Users Group, which includes the biggest of the biggest polluters. He's even mentioned in First Energy's previous bankruptcies. And now he's the head of the entity in our state that really has a direct impact on all of our clean energy development. And even in his very short tenure, he has put his time, unfortunately, to pretty bad use, because he's effectively killed offshore wind, which included 500 good paying jobs and $253 million in investments. He's delayed large scale solar, even over the objections of his own staff. And he has tried to stop utilities from saving people money through voluntary energy efficiency programs, things that are no-brainers. We're talking HVAC systems and upgrading your windows, things that are good for everybody. He is joined by Representative Bill Seitz, who's been working with Sam Randazzo to get rid of the clean energy standards since 2013. Seitz has received $137,000 since 2008 from First Energy, Duke, AEP, and other energy PACs. Right now, he's out there telling people we don't need to repeal HB 6, and he is still in the Republican leadership of the House. Now, look, they got rid of Larry Householder as the speaker, although he is still in the body. That's a whole different subject. They have replaced him with a guy named Bob Cupp. Bob Cupp is somebody who I'm very hopeful will bring integrity back to the office. But we got to be honest about his connections. First Energy is one of Cupp's top donors with more than $21,000 in the door. Bob Murray gave Cupp $11,000. AEP gave him $13,000. In fact, when Cupp was a Supreme Court justice, ethics violations were filed because he took money from the energy industry when he was deciding cases related to them. Hopefully it'll all work out. Cupp didn't support Larry Householder in the speaker's race in 2019, but he did vote for this bad bill, and he hasn't scheduled a floor vote for repeal. So we stand and watch. Of course, the final person that is still around, at least until November, is Trump. The Energy Policy Institute, who does excellent opera research connecting the money flow to utilities, has recorded that the First Energy jet has flown to DC more than 30 times since the beginning of the Trump administration. And that's bad news for all of us. So the fight continues. I'm going to let Ian from the Brennan Center tell you about the details of how we can shine more light on dark money. But here are a few other requests. You can see here I have a couch warrior. Let's go ahead and embrace that we're in the middle of a pandemic, and I want you to know what you can do exactly from your couch. Number one, I need everybody here to demand a repeal of HB 6. First Energy is on tap to make $1.3 billion. The coal industry will get another $2 billion. Even if they spent twice as much as what we know about, even if their top guys go to jail, these companies will make bank and continue to buy whatever they want. So this bill must go so they never do this again. So we need a repeal of HB 6. Number two, we need to replace it with something that is smart and competitive. The bill should be replaced with one that levels the playing field for clean energy. Clean energy can compete, so let's not hamstring the inevitable. Instead, let's invest in those jobs, in healthier communities, in people, and a stronger economy by capturing the fastest growing sector of the market in the world. A recent report by E2 found that a reasonable investment right now in clean energy could help the economy come back faster after COVID to the tune of more than 4 million jobs over the next 5 years. And it could generate more than $66 billion in GDP each of those years during that same time period. So it's really important that we replace HB 6 with something that puts Ohio in a competitive advantage. And finally, guys, I hope that Catherine will agree with me on this. We have to vote. We have an election in 84 days. Make your plan now, because we will still be suffering from a pandemic in November. And voting by mail, which is absolutely safe, still requires an advanced plan to make sure that you can get counted. And bring attention to your candidates. If your legislator isn't demanding a repeal every single day, ask them why on social media, through a socially distanced conversation, in a letter to the editor. We cannot let them get away with it, and they have to know that we are watching. Our democracy absolutely is depending on it. So here's where you can find me. One little plug. We have an Ohio Public Interest Environmental Law Conference coming up on September 24th and 25th. There's CLEs that are available to attorneys, and we're also welcoming the general public. We're going to be talking a lot about HB6. In fact, Catherine will be joining us along with the ACLU and the Juvenile Justice Coalition. There's a lot. I've just kind of scratched the surface. I know this is a lot of data, a lot of numbers, but there's a lot to fight for here. And a lot of opportunities to really take this moment and put Ohio on a different kind of path. And that's it.
Well, thank you so much, Heather. So we're going to be transitioning to Ian Vandewalker from the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU. He is senior counsel for their democracy program, and his area is, as you might imagine, money and politics. He also does some work surrounding foreign interference. So we're really blessed to have an expert in campaign finance here to walk us through some of the policy options. And I also wanted to highlight that he is a gentleman and a scholar because he has a master's degree in philosophy from nearby Indiana University, as well as clearly a law degree. And so Ian, whenever you're ready to start sharing your slides, while you're getting that set up, I'm going to just tell people that we're going to do questions at the end. When we hear from Ian, and I know for some folks you're having some difficulty hearing us. We're doing the best that we can, and we'll make some changes kind of for next time. For folks who have wondered about slides, yes, we will make sure that you all have slides and are able to look at these in some detail. And we'll also be following up with some action items, because there's nothing worse than learning all of these things and not having something really specific to do. And it looks like, Ian, looks like you're all ready.
I think so. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me, and it's good to be here to talk. It's an unfortunate set of events for Ohio, but it's good for me to be here to talk with you about it. So as Catherine mentioned at the outset, I'm going to be talking about dark money and how to fight it basically with law. So what is dark money? It means money that the sources of which are unknown. So one of the main, if not the main these days, ways that we regulate money in politics is that we make sure it's transparent, that people know where the money is coming from, who's spending the money, who's getting the money. That was the first campaign finance law that was ever passed over 100 years ago. And it is basic to all of the state's laws and the federal system. Unfortunately, the system is not perfect, and there are sort of loopholes that allow people to spend money in secret, and that's called dark money, and has led to the allegations against Householder and others in Ohio. So what should we want out of campaign finance disclosure regime? Like how do we know one is working? Well, it should be constitutional. That is, it should not be struck down by a court. It should apply to all political spending. It shouldn't just leave some things out, apply to some things and leave other things, because we know that the sneaky people will follow the places that aren't being regulated. It should reveal the real sources of money. So not just some group that nobody knows what it is, but actually where does the money come from? Real people, real special interests. It should not be full of loopholes that, again, can be allow sneaky people to evade the rule. And it should actually work to inform voters, real people. So let's take a closer look at some of these things and see what those will look like. So disclosure laws should be constitutional. Well, good luck. Good news, as Catherine mentioned at the outset, Citizens United said that disclosure of campaign finance is solidly constitutional. And the court has over the years talked about the constitutional benefits of disclosure, the sort of First Amendment benefits, the democracy benefits. Disclosure can inform voters about what candidates stand for. So for example, if you don't know anything about the candidate standing in an election, except that one is supported by, let's say an oil company, and one is supported by, the Sierra Club or an environmental group, then now you do know something about what those people stand for and what they're going to do once they're elected. And of course, disclosure allows voters to hold elected officials accountable for their relationships with supporters, right? when you vote, when someone's up for re-election, you vote for them, you vote based on what they've done, but what they've done might have a different meaning based on who's paying their bills, who's paying them money. You might think, did they really think this was in the public interest, or were they working to support someone who was giving them or their campaigns money? And finally, of course, the court has recognized that disclosure can deter corruption by exposing large transactions. It's harder to do corrupt things, including bribery, if the money is exposed to the public, to the press, to law enforcement. So ironically, given the fact that Citizens United was so supportive of disclosure, it also caused an explosion in dark money in the federal systems and the state system. The reason is Citizens United said corporations can spend unlimited amounts in elections. And what the sort of smart, sneaky people realized is these 501c4 nonprofits are corporations, so they can spend unlimited amounts. Now, the court said it's fine for all that to be disclosed, but the court didn't create laws that would generate that disclosure. They said it's okay for a legislature to do so. And in many legislatures, including Congress and in Ohio, those changes that would bring about disclosure for these groups that had previously not been able to spend never happened, right? So you went from a system where in many states, as in Ohio, corporate spending was banned. So of course there was no disclosure requirement because it was banned. The Supreme Court washes away that ban. Now they can spend, but there's still no disclosure requirement. There's a hole in the law. Secondly, disclosure laws should apply to all political spending. So currently, disclosure, whether you have to disclose your donors or not, whether you have to reveal who you get your money come from, depends more on how you register your group than what you do. So if you're sneaky political operative and you want all of your money to be public, you register as a political committee and you will disclose all your donors. If you don't want your money to be public, you can register or not register as a political committee, essentially to be some other thing. The favorite vehicle is these 501c4 nonprofits, but there are others. And those donor disclosure requirements on political committees won't apply to you. So, and that's how it works in the federal system as well, and it allows, it's allowed over $1 billion in dark money in federal elections, as well as the explosion in the states. So what should we do instead? Well, instead, right, the registration, the form of the group shouldn't be relevant. What's relevant is, are you spending in elections? You should simply have that act of spending in elections, spending to influence elections. That act itself triggers the requirement to disclose your donors. So that's the basic principle. There are obviously many ways of doing that in the specifics. You can require, essentially, if someone spends on politics above a certain amount, $1,000, $10,000, then they have to disclose all of their donors. That might generate problems for certain corporations that bring in a lot of money. And there are ways of dealing with that, including allowing groups to set up a separate fund. So if you're going to spend on politics, you spend out of that separate fund and you require all the donors into those funds to be disclosed. And another sort of angle on this applying to all political spending is that sometimes the laws only apply to what's called express advocacy, meaning ads or mailers that say vote for so-and-so or don't vote for so-and-so. Now, the political operatives know this, of course, and they're much more likely to spend money on the kinds of ads that you've probably seen that will come out, in the weeks before an election and will say, Senator so-and-so voted against the anti-puppy kicking bill. Call Senator so-and-so and tell him to oppose puppy kicking, right? That ad with the deep voice and the dark imagery and everything, that ad never mentioned the election, never said don't vote for Senator so-and-so, but it's obvious that comes out 2 weeks before an election. They don't want you to vote for that senator who's up for re-election just by the fact that they're criticizing him or her. So you have to make sure that whatever your rules capture that kind of spending. That's sometimes called electioneering communications. And Ohio law is actually pretty good on those, but it all needs to come together with the corporations, unions, 501c4s being all subject to the disclosure rules. So third, I believe, I'm not sure actually which number I'm on. I should have numbered them, but I guess it doesn't matter. Next, disclosure laws should reveal the real source of money. So again, as Catherine mentioned, in this scandal and in other scandals we've seen, including with big groups like the Koch brothers network of political funders, sometimes money passes through multiple groups, so that even if you learn the donors of one group, it turns out those donors are themselves these anonymous dark money groups. And this is alleged in the householder complaint that there was a federal PAC involved in some of the spending, and federal PACs have to report all of their donors. And if you go and look at the donor disclosures, it will say one of the donors is Generation Now. Well, where did that money come from, right? Now we know, but it could just as easily, and you see this frequently, a super PAC reveals its donor, it has $5 million in expenditures, and its entire revenue came from a $5 million donation from a dark money group that shares the exact same name and the same PO box and the same, lawyer in Alexandria, Virginia. That's the registered agent for the corporation. So the point being, some people call this the Russian nesting doll problem, that if you find out the donors to one group, it's just another group and you have to find out the donors to that group. So disclosure laws should deal with this by requiring that if you transfer money to a group that spends money on politics, that transfer itself is treated as a political expenditure, and that has to be disclosed. So that the donor disclosure follows the money back to its original source, and that will be revealed to be an actual person or some other identifiable special interest. Next, disclosure laws should not be full of loopholes. So one key issue here is the issue of coordination, which again, Catherine mentioned and shows up in the householder complaint. So this is when, for an example, an outside dark money group is run by a candidate's close associates or staff members, choreographs its activity with the candidate. That's not really an outside group, right? Imagine I'm a candidate, I go to you and I'd say, really like you to give me $1 million, but that would be illegal because Ohio has $13,000 contribution limits. So you can't give me more than $13,000. But it just so happens that my chief of staff runs a nonprofit. We talk all the time about strategy. That nonprofit is going to spend a bunch of money to get me reelected. And you can give them $1 million, right? In what sense is that not money that's going directly to me, right? I mean, on paper, in some kind of legalistic sense, you didn't write the check to me, but that is, of course, a contribution to me. And so should be limited by the contribution limits and, of course, should be disclosed. The householder complaint is full of people saying, I am householder when I represent Generation Now. This is the group. This is householders group. This is, so people were having those kinds of conversations about making clear that money to, allegedly having these conversations, making clear that money to Generation Now was money to a candidate. So one way of dealing with this is with bright line coordination rules that say, if a group is run by current or recent staff, if the candidate has fundraised for the group, if they're sharing strategic consultants, the same people are making up their messaging ads, then contributions to that group will be deemed contributions to the candidate and therefore subject to contribution limits and disclosures. That's one major loophole to close. Next, disclosure laws should actually inform voters. So we want disclosure to be usable by the voters to serve those purposes that we talked about, that I talked about at the beginning of my presentation in terms of informing the voters and allowing them to hold people accountable. So this is sort of the nuts and bolts. This one's obvious. Disclosure should come before the election on a regular schedule. Right? Disclosure after the election is not useful. to my knowledge, Ohio doesn't have a problem with this, but sometimes it does, especially for primaries, come up. And especially, again, there are sneaky people who will abuse whatever rules you have. Sometimes people form a group legally in the week before the election so that the first disclosure deadline is not until after the election. The rules should prevent operatives from being able to do that kind of thing. Another key aspect of disclosure. So I've been talking about disclosure in the sense of when money is spent or when money is received, that goes into a report, which goes into some public filing, which is then available on some regular timeline, whether that's quarterly or monthly. And if someone wants to know about that, they can go to the state's website, they can find it out, or reporters more likely can go and then report on it, which will be consumed by regular people. But a whole nother avenue of disclosure is, what does the ad itself say? So this is called disclaimers in the business. So you see this in political ads all the time. At the end of the ad, it's the lawyer voice that talks really fast comes on and says, paid for by the citizens. That's a way, assuming you can understand what they're saying, is a way to make sure that you know who's trying to convince you of something at the moment that they're doing it, not later when you go and look at some filing. So that's necessary, and that is required for political ads, Ohio law. But we of course come up to this problem that sometimes the paid for by, all it reveals is Ohioans for a better Ohio. And who's that? What is that? What does that stand for? That could be, a nuclear energy company. That could be a teachers union. That could be literally anybody. So one way of dealing with, and to be clear, in every situation, every time you see special interests getting caught trying to change, especially on ballot initiatives, especially where they're speaking directly to the voters, they always change their name to something that you cannot tell what it is. So one way of dealing with that is what's called sometimes top 3 disclosure. So in the text of the ad, you don't just say your cute name, Ohioans for a Better Ohio. You also have to say, here are the top 3 sources of money, and those have to be, real people. So that, if that were in place for an organization like Generation Now, then First Energy would have been listed in the ad itself. Again, every time you saw the ad, you would see that flash up on the screen, and you would know that that was a nuclear energy interest trying to convince you of something. And then finally, so one of the things, as I mentioned, if you sort of try to do the shoe leather work to figure out what a dark money group, who a dark money group represents, a lot of times, you can sort of follow the registration documents. A lot of times what you discover is that their address is a PO box in Alexandria, Virginia. And the sort of registered agent will be a lawyer whose job it is to register corporations and has registered thousands, if not millions, of corporations. Or sometimes it's that person's secretary. That's even better. And so the trail just goes cold, right? All you have is a PO box and just some nameless or some faceless corporate registering agent. So one way of dealing with that, and note that all this allows people to do is create shell corporations, and all shell corporations are good for is hiding the source of money, whether for money laundering or political dark money purposes. So you could make that illegal, right? You could require that any corporation or other, including nonprofit corporations, doing business in the state has to register the name of an actual person who actually has decision-making power over the organization's work, right? So not just a secretary that's on paper somewhere, but someone who's actually has decision-making power would be on the hook if that corporation were, say, discovered to be engaged in criminal activity. And that helps address the dark money problem because, again, it creates a paper trail that goes back to a real person. And, coincidentally also helps make it harder to launder money for, drug dealers and criminals. but that's not what we're here to talk about. So I will, I think that's, yes, that's the end of my presentation. I also wanted to mention, because it has, well, because Catherine asked me, and because it has come up in the news, that there is a bill that's been proposed by, it's a bipartisan bill, and has, I believe, gotten sort of public support from a number of Republicans and Democrats, including the Secretary of State, that would address some of these issues. I'm going to stop screen sharing so I can look at my notes and you can't see them. So that's called is HB 737. So one of the things that it would do, I'm just going to briefly say a little bit about it. One of the things it would do would be to broaden the reporting requirements. I mentioned that if you don't want to disclose, don't register as a political committee. One of the ways to deal with that is to make there be a spending threshold. So if you spend some certain amount of money, you sort of automatically get the reporting requirement. And the bill is intended to do that, intended to regulate, to cover nonprofits. Another thing, interestingly, as I mentioned, when Citizens United struck down bans on corporate spending, it didn't replace it with anything. And Ohio has never replaced their corporate bans with anything. This bill now, 10 years later, would do that. It would codify that corporations and unions can spend in politics, and would apply the political committee disclosure requirements to those groups. A couple of things that I mentioned that it doesn't do and are room for improvement, I think, would be a strong rule for getting at the source of the money that goes through multiple entities. So who are the donors to the donors? Make sure that there's at least some way of getting at that so that people can't just hide behind a shell group. The bright line coordination rules about making sure I can't just send you to my favorite group over there that can get away with taking $1 million outside of contribution limits. And the top 3 rule that would put disclaimers in, would make disclaimers more informative by saying the top 3 donors to the organization. So just a couple of thoughts there. I'm happy to obviously participate in discussion and answer questions, but I will stop there.
Well, thank you. So that was a lot of information, and people did have some good questions. So this is one that that we actually received in advance. This is Mark Weaver said that folks have an absolute right to anonymous speech. And my question is that actually true? And the second follow-up is, what kinds of attacks are going on disclosure? Because I've always had a sense that transparency was something that was just generally agreed to be a public good. And I'm going to throw that to you, Ian.
Yeah, right. There is a tradition of anonymous speech, as people who are opposed to disclosure always mention, going back to the Federalist Papers. And, there is no absolute right to anonymous speech. So one of the things about the First Amendment jurisprudence in this area is that elections are treated differently, right? You have a right to anonymous speech generally, but when it comes to elections, we say there's this other interest, this other First Amendment interest in elections functioning properly, and that requires informed voters, and it requires politicians to not be able to cheat the public. Right, so those interests require there to be a level of transparency that in the world of elections, in this narrowly defined scope of elections, trumps any right to anonymous speech. Now, that said, even within that context, there are constitutional rules around when people's safety is genuinely threatened by disclosure, the courts will exempt them from those disclosure requirements. So this happened notably with the NAACP in 1955 in Alabama. The court said, if we make you disclose, people are literally going to set your houses on fire and murder you. So we're going to make an exception in that sort of narrow set of circumstances. So if someone were to be able to prove similar circumstances today, they would have the same constitutional benefit, but just not wanting people to know who you are or what kinds of political causes you support or not wanting to be criticized on Twitter is not sufficient for that. And I talked long enough that I forgot the second part of the question.
No, so one of the things that and it could just be that because I think a lot about like our right to know and the Freedom of Information Act and our Sunshine Law, I've wondered about the kinds of attacks on disclosure. It seems like there's a lot more of the conversation about the need for, absolute privacy or what I would think of as kind of an attack on our right to know.
Yeah, I will say that the conversation has changed, and I think there are probably different reasons for that, but I think one way of understanding it is that there has been a constant drumbeat of attacks on campaign finance regulation by wealthy interests who want to be able to influence politics with money over decades, right? Since the sort of current era of campaign finance started with Watergate and federal laws that were passed in response to Watergate, which generated much of the system that we have today. It was immediately attacked by people who thought it was going to hurt their ability to by influencing politics. And those attacks through the courts gradually became more and more successful. So it used to be that 20 years ago, people would say, oh, I'm fine, I'm fine with disclosure. We should just have no contribution limits and have it all disclosed. And I think that side has just sort of moved the goalposts over time. As they keep winning in the courts, they keep getting this bit struck down, and then they say, well, the real problem is this bit. And then they get that bit struck down and they say, well, the real problem is this bit. And now they've succeeded in striking down so much with the conservative courts, with the Roberts court, that what's left is disclosure. And now that's being attacked as, violating fundamental freedoms when, the people most in danger from disclosure are the rich special interests who want to secretly buy politicians.
So this is my next question. So, we have used the phrase dark money or secret money, especially when we talked about House Bill 6. But we're talking about the dark money or secret money that we couldn't trace to get candidates in place that would support Larry Householder's election to become speaker. So literally dark money in candidate elections. But we also, and this is kind of a general way, we talk about the dark money related to what I think of as the lobbying of the public to support the legislation. So there were tons of ads, TV ads and mailers that we all received, and radio, and that was during the process of the actual legislative process. And then there was the dark money to push against the ballot campaign where we didn't know what was going on. And what you laid out was what I think of as good disclosure related to candidate campaigns. Are you thinking that you would look at this somewhat similarly for ballot campaigns? And then how do you see this disclosure working when it comes to lobbying activities?
Right, that's a good question. So the principles for ballot measure campaigns are the same. I think even though there's not a candidate to corrupt, in some sense, you sort of switch to worrying about corrupting the voters themselves through bribes in the same way, but through essentially deception and being tricked by a special interest that hasn't revealed itself into voting against their interest, or people might vote the way the special interest tells them to for their own reasons. Of course, that's entirely legitimate. But the idea is that it shouldn't be based on secrecy or deception. So I think essentially the same regime applies. I mean, there are certain things that don't, like the coordination rules sort of don't make sense because there's no candidate to coordinate with. But in as much as the things are applicable in the first place, then I think they should apply. Lobbying is different. As I said, the First Amendment jurisprudence treats elections as different from everything else. And it's not entirely clear because there aren't that many cases on lobbying, but it appears that lobbying doesn't fall exactly into that same domain. And therefore, there are greater First Amendment restrictions on what you can do about spending on lobbying. That said, disclosure is the least burdensome kind of regulation that there is. Disclosure of expenditures on lobbying is pretty universally accepted in places that have bothered to do it, including the federal system. So, I would say that disclosure of expenditures, especially very large expenditures, talking about above some threshold, on lobbying is on very solid constitutional ground.
I mentioned this in the chat, Catherine, but I wanted to make sure that I said, like OEC Action Fund. So OEC has a 501c4 affiliate, OEC Action Fund, and we use that for lobbying. And to the extent appropriate, certainly use that for other purposes whenever it's appropriate. But, I think that there's a movement afoot, even with 501c4s who have nothing to hide, to be totally fine with disclosure. In fact, it's interesting to talk to, I'd say like 90% of my colleagues are the folks who are happy for more disclosure, and also very comfortable with starting to think through what are some of the other rules that Ian covered that make a lot of sense. And I think that there is, whenever somebody doesn't want sunshine, I question the motives, and I think that's one thing to consider whenever you're really putting this out there. But I also want to note that there's going to be a huge announcement tomorrow for our Repeal HB6 campaign with a whole bunch of different strange bedfellows, right? Not only OEC, but a lot of other organizations. And when that announcement happens, one of the commitments that we all had to make to be a part of the coalition was disclosure. So everything will have radical sunlight. And I think that that's really the way campaigns are going to be run in the future that have credibility.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that. One of the things that struck me during the time that signature collection was going on was that you had the dark money that was the pro House Bill 6, but then also the people that were seeking the referendum didn't actually have to disclose anything either because of the way Ohio rules are. Unless you basically are successful and submit it, you don't have to actually disclose. And so one of the things I've been thinking about, has to do with improved disclosure related to those ballot committees. It just seems like, yes, as we're thinking more about transparency and accountability. And so it sounds like, these are ongoing conversations that we should be having with everyone about, like, well, where is it, what is the information we need, and how can we actually put that into law so that we actually have it in place. One thing I always thought was hilarious is the Ohio Elections Commission actually has what they call an advisory opinion. And their advisory opinion from 2010 is that we should all, if we actually run an ad as dark, that there's no requirement to disclose if it's run with corporate money, but you should. And why don't you voluntarily do it? Well, 10 years later, no one has voluntarily done it. And I cut you off, Heather.
No, I think that the other thing, it's funny because like we actually kind of a hindsight being 2020 with the signature campaign, we're like, why didn't we disclose? And I'm like, it's because we were working 24/7 to try to get those stupid signatures. And so disclosure actually takes a little bit of time. It's totally worth it to shine sunlight on all of this problem. The other thing I would want us to be really careful of is making sure that we get the content in a period of time to make sure that it's worthwhile. Because the one thing that I could see happening is disclosure, but it's like on an annual basis. So, like they'll basically, you spend the money now and a year later, you might find out who funded some of this stuff. And by then you've kind of moved on. And in fact, in Ohio, we've seen this happen, right? Like We've had ECOT scandals. We've had payday lender scandals. We've had HB6 scandals. It keeps going on and on and on. And then time moves on and we forget about the issue. And so I think it's really important not just to have the disclosure laws, but to have the content in a timely manner so that we can really point out some of the self-interested motives.
Well, I had a question that was from a participant here that was trying to figure out why it is so many Democrats voted for it. You know, they didn't actually, they might have received a little money from First Energy, but they just trying to figure out why.
There are a couple of Democrats who've received a lot of First Energy money, but I actually feel like there were a lot of different reasons we heard. You know, there were a few of the labor unions, although not all of the labor unions who supported HB6. So there were a few. And, you know, some of the plants were located close to a couple of the Democratic members' districts. So they had constituents who worked at those plants. So we did hear some of that. But I will say, you know, almost the entire Democratic caucus now has called for a repeal. In fact, today they actually issued a protest of the vote for HB6, which is largely ceremonial and, you know, kind of like, you know, just kind of a placeholder, but it's still an important statement that the Democrats didn't have all the facts that related to how this money was being spent. And I have serious concerns with the way that this bill was passed. And so I think that, and not just the Democrats, you know, we have a majority of the Senate is actually co-sponsoring a bill to repeal this. And that includes Democrats and Republicans. Laura Lanise, one member, has been championing clean energy for years. And in fact, is out there all the time talking about this issue. So it doesn't have to be really partisan, and nor should it be. This is really, for me, this is about health. This is about the environment and climate change, but this is also about jobs and the economy. What's good for Ohio and its people. And I think that that's the biggest thing that we're going to be talking about with HB6, in addition to this obviously corrupt process.
So I have one for Ian. There is a belief that deep-pocketed entities like these utility companies will always find a way to get around regulations that they don't like. Is that true?
So this is a popular critique of the effort to regulate campaign finance. People say that big money will always find a way. And it's true that the people who want to use money to get influence will keep working to find a way. It's also true that embezzlers who work at big banks will always keep working to find a way to embezzle money, but nobody says, well, we should just make it legal to embezzle to solve that problem. You know, yes, people will keep trying to find loopholes. So you keep updating the laws. You write strong laws, you create a strong enforcement entity that has enforcement powers, multiple, right? So you have civil enforcement through an elections board or a secretary of state. You have criminal enforcement through law enforcement, you know, state AGs and others. And when you find somebody does something that you didn't think of, then you make that thing illegal too. So, you know, which is how we deal with other kinds of things that we don't want, right? When you create a new health insurance system, somebody will come along and find a way to scam it. And so you update the system to take away the ability to scam that. Now, I'm making it sound like that's easy. Not necessarily easy, but it is possible with effort and with, you know, the desire to keep money in politics running with, you know, a democracy running with integrity, even while there's money changing hands.
So this is for Heather. It's slightly off topic, but because it's about direct democracy, I decided to ask it. There were attempts to intimidate the signature gatherers, which seems like a clear attempt to attack direct democracy, should someone go to jail over something like that?
So, if this is kind of a hard question for me, because, like, this wasn't just, it got personal, right? Like, people were not just beating up our petitioners. They weren't just screaming obscene things while they were trying to gather signatures. They were threatening people's lives. Like I got threats. Like we all were in situations where you're like, is this real? Right? Like, I'm talking about wind turbines. Is this a real thing? I absolutely believe that there was criminal behavior in this, and I absolutely believe some of these people need to go to jail. For how long and what that looks like, that's a more complicated answer, but I certainly do not think that these companies should get to keep this money that was just a huge big old Christmas present for them. Like that is the one thing that I absolutely know. And that's what we're going to be really working hard for. But absolutely, some of the behavior here was 100%. Like, I mean, people laid hands on people. So this was like, there were physical assaults. And so I certainly think that someone should be held accountable for that, as well as those other things,
Yeah, I actually know somebody who was registering people to vote, and because she had a clipboard, she was yelled at and screamed at.
I mean, like, people were shoving papers in the car windshield wipers that were threatening. I lived down the road from a farmer's market, and one Saturday morning I had somebody like push me, right? And I'm 5'3", you know what I mean? Like, it's not, this got really personal. And, I think that we all have to do better, right? And we have to expect more of our politicians. If you read the Columbus Dispatch 4-part article, I can't remember which one, I think it was like part 3. They talk about a tape recorded conversation that where they were talking about the intimidation tactics, and they were laughing about it. And that was, the fact that this has become just part of the game, that should be embarrassing. And the folks who voted for this bill, the folks who still haven't scheduled the vote for a repeal of this bill, they are condoning it right now. And it's really important that they understand that they are condoning it as long as this bill is allowed to stand.
All right, I have a question for Ian. In Congress, so this is not here, not state level, in Congress, HJR 48 proposes an amendment that makes clear corporate entities, even nonprofits, do not have constitutional rights, and money spent on elections is not a protected form of free speech and should be regulated. How do you think such an amendment would help with the problem of dark money?
Right, so you're talking about a constitutional amendment. The first thing I'll mention about a constitutional amendment is it's really hard. It requires, the typical method requires you to get something through Congress with supermajorities and then supermajorities of the states. So that takes time and is hard. The second thing I'll mention about a constitutional amendment is however you amend the Constitution, it will then be interpreted by the courts. The same courts that have interpreted the current Constitution, which at no point gives any corporations any rights, they interpreted that to give corporations rights. So, at the Brennan Center, we don't pursue a constitutional amendment strategy on money and politics issues. We don't oppose a constitutional amendment strategy. We just don't think it's the most productive use of our resources here. A a constitutional amendment that tried to take rights to spend in elections away from corporations would address part of the problem, but you would still have large amounts of money flowing through politics. You would still need disclosure to find out if it's a human being spending that money, who's that human being? Did they earn all the money themselves, or did someone give them the money, as people currently give the secretaries of super PACs, which essentially, a super PAC isn't really a thing. It's a piece of paper that a person controls. So, that could be a piece of the puzzle. It's a piece of the puzzle that would be hard to get to, but it would still require campaign finance. As I said before, people will always be trying to find ways around it. So it's not just corporations, it's not just dark money, it's not just super PACs, it's just not just big money, it's all of these things that work together and need to be regulated in a coherent whole.
So this is going to be our very last question. It'll take me just a second. I'm not sure I understand this question. Ooh, this one I do actually understand. Can you give us examples? Sorry, I feel like I should get my readers again. Sorry, everybody, I've gotten super old. In fact, one of the things that occurred to me, I was about to say, one of the great sadnesses, like one of those like lingering sadnesses that my mom had to do with ERA. And when you think about ERA, like the Equal Rights Amendment, like it just seems so extremely obvious, and just the pain of how long that took. And that doesn't mean so my move to amend friends, that does not mean that it is not worth our time. It just means it's a long and possibly sad battle that might continue past our own lives. And on that note, we're going to ask a disclosure question, because before we get to really transforming the entire system, we should be thinking about what we can do now that we know is constitutional. And so Heather throws out like climate change. Okay, so this is what someone was interested in. Can you give examples of states that actually do dark money disclosure well, so that people can look at that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the sort of superstars in this right now are California and Montana. Montana is sort of one of those interesting case studies where it was a single industry state with the mining interests who literally owned state government for decades and decades. And reformers have really said, we need good disclosure. This is like a key need, and it's a bipartisan issue there. And they have solid rules requiring that anybody who's spending in politics disclose their money. And like I said, that if you're giving money to a group who's giving money to a group, still have to disclose those layers. In California also, as a very large state, has very recently increased its disclosure, including through focusing on the online medium, which is a massive new area for political expenditure that frequently is not reflected in laws. In fact, some of Ohio's laws, it's explicitly excluded from disclosure laws that internet communications will not be covered. But more and more political spending is happening online. So that's an important frontier to make sure that whatever sensible disclosure laws you have apply there as well.
So you will notice that Jay Costa from Voter Right to Know threw out information about a ballot measure that's on the ballot this November in Alaska. And so there are examples from other states. We're going to explore the bills that are out there that have been proposed, the legislation proposed at the webinar on August 27th. That'll also be at 7 p.m. So it'll be post-work for people mostly. And we hope you'll be able to join you. For those of you that had some difficulty hearing us tonight, we'll spend some time trying to figure out how to adjust and make that work a little bit better. And we appreciate your patience. And send us an email if there's things that you missed that you had questions about, and I'll see if we can find a way to answer them. And I wanted to just say a great big thank you to our panelists, and a big thank you to folks like Mia Lewis and, just Tiffany and Michael, Becky, who helped make this all come together, because we are not that technologically advanced. And so a big thank you to Trent as well. And I just wanted to let you know how much I appreciate your joining us tonight, because we have a big fight for good, strong transparency. And thank you all. You have a good evening.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Bye.